Ryan, you were telling me about Goose Game and the Goat Simulator?
Yeah, so I was saying that, just full disclosure, I have not played Goat Sim yet, but I did play Goose Game, and I thought Goose Game was a fun game. But I also thought that there was something, I guess, ironic about the game, and I don't really think that the developers, or I imagine the developers aren't having us play that game because they want us to have the most fun that we've ever had with a game. I think that they want us to kind of think that the entire game is a joke. And what I imagine is different between the two is that Goat Sim isn't really supposed to be fun. It's just kind of supposed to be like a dumb joke that you play for a couple of hours. Whereas Goose Game, I think, requires more innovation and curiosity. And before we began recording, I was saying that you brought up like postmodern, how Goat Sim is like a postmodern game. And I was saying that, like, if that's the case, which I agree with, then I think Goose Game could be considered post-postmodern.
Mm-hmm.
And like the main difference being that postmodern is kind of just the ironic and like the throwaway. If you think about like a novel that's completely unreadable because it's so like dense, or that it's like not even worthwhile. The whole point is to kind of like screw with your mind. The postmodern would be something that is similarly dense or hard to read, but it's serving some kind of point other than the irony, or other than just kind of being like a throwaway. There's something, in David Foster Wallace's language, he talks about it having sincerity, an additional layer of sincerity. And I think that that's kind of what we get with Goose Game. Does that make sense?
So somewhat. I guess there was like a lot there to unpack. Like, okay, so first off, you mentioned that Goat Sim and Goose Game, they're kind of like, they're jokes. And I know you don't mean in like a mean way, like that. I want to know, like, how do you mean? Like, what do you mean by, like, Goat Simulator is you call the game a joke. Goose Game, you call it a joke. I understand the joke in the sense of, like, oh, I'm a goose and I'm causing trouble. Isn't that so funny and, like, mundane and quirky? As the same thing with, like, Goat Simulator. That's how I interpret them as jokes. Or rather, I interpret the game as telling that as a joke. Is that what you mean, or do you feel that the game itself?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
If you think about a racing game, right? A racing game can be like an actual racing simulator because, like, you want to drive really fast cars, and you want to be on all of these cool tracks, and just explore a kind of realm that you couldn't ordinarily like partake in, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody wants to be a goat, and I wouldn't describe the genre of Goat Sim as a simulation game. I think it's like perhaps a puzzle game. They're making you find odd ways to do these tasks, but it's puzzle mechanics. For at least for Goose Game, the puzzle mechanics aren't incredibly elaborate, and I think, like, from what I've heard, Goat Sim is even less elaborate. So the idea is that it's not a great puzzler. It's not a simulation, really. So it's just kind of something that you do on a Saturday for a couple hours when you're trying to pass the time,
mm-hmm.
to have a few laughs. I think we don't really have a comedy genre in games, as far as I've never really heard anybody talk about games through the lens of comedy.
Right.
Or, I mean, at least that's not a common genre. I mean, like, there are South Park games, and
I would say probably Leisure Suit Larry was like also Conker's Bad Fur Day. I think that was explicitly a comedy game without being labeled comedy. Like, it was probably just like adventure platformer. But yeah, I think, like, comedy, like in most movies nowadays, there isn't just a comedy movie. It's just like a layer that gets added in. But I don't think that was the case, like, in the 1990s and, like, maybe early aughts.
Right, and that speaks to the post-postmodern distinction as well. It's harder to be comedic. You and I have talked before about how when we were in high school, we were so much funnier than we are now, and especially with each other, because we didn't think about things that were offensive, really, or not at least not as much as we do now. We're much more deeply aware of social issues, and we don't push the boundary the way that we used to. And similarly, I don't find comedy movies, Goose Game is very wholesome. Goose Game is a very wholesome game. Comedy movies are often, punching down, or there's something about them that I just can't enjoy them the same way that I used to. But I do like comedic scenes in a drama. I much prefer.
Mm-hmm.
I watched a lot of comedies when I was in middle and high school, and I almost never watch them now. I mean, I've seen like one comedy that I can think of in 2020, and it's not like a movie I chose. I watched it with someone else.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole different conversation, honestly. And also, actually, rather, I think it's a conversation that's already been covered pretty well by, I believe it was Wisecrack. This YouTube channel Wisecrack did a great video on how comedy like ascended being a genre, especially with the rise of the Marvel films, because that basically made comedy like 1/3 of the genre, along with action and whatever else. Anyway, getting back to the main games being like Goose Game and Goat Simulator, I kind of get what you're saying, right? Like, I now get what you're saying, and like I said before, like I knew it wasn't like malicious in any way. The idea is like to almost be, with Goat Simulator, I feel like it's to be like crudely avant-garde. Like, when the like gaming society, when the gaming consumers, like let's say the mainstream gaming consumer, like when they get a game, they expect it to be this like very clean, smooth, like cinematically presented thing, and let's say Goat Simulator like completely goes against that. Like none of the interactions are like smooth and paired up. Like in Days Gone, when Deacon St. John goes to like slice somebody with a machete, those are two actor units getting brought together and locked into a certain position so that they can play two very specifically authored animations so that combat can happen when you press the X button or whatever. Whereas in Goat Simulator, it's like, nah, dude, just run wherever you want and hit the headbutt button, and if you're in the right trigger box, something will happen. Like, I don't care if you don't make contact with this thing. And I think like the crudeness of that is, I say crudeness, some people say janky, whatever you want to call it. It's a level of roughness, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that level of friction, that level of roughness, like it has a charm to it depending on like how it's applied and where it's applied. And Goat Simulator, like you said, it has all that roughness that makes it for a package that you end up playing for like an afternoon, and then you're like, okay, I'm kind of like done with this. Unless you're someone who like just really gets into that, but I don't think that's the rule, right? It's just like you can have a favorite song, like some people will attach themselves to Goat Simulator, and it won't necessarily be like, oh, this is the most amazing game. It'll just be like, nah, this is just something I really, really like and I find entertaining.
Thank you for listening to Deep in the D-Pad. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends about the show and subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts.
For more, you can also follow us on YouTube, we're Deep in the D-Pad, Facebook @DeepDPad, and Twitter @DeepInTheDPad1.
And if you want to ask us questions or get a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the show with music.